Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dolika Jyoti Sharma and is an assistant professor in English at Guwahati University, Guwahati, Assam. The present module is on the aesthetics of self-fashioning and Indian poetry, which is included in the paper on Indian writing in English. This module deals with the problematic of self-definition and representation of subjectivity in the larger framework of national imaginary in terms of the creation of a register of poetic experiments instrumental to the process of decolonization, which introduces a shift in perception in pre-independence and post-independence Indian English poetry. Indian English poetry, according to Bruce King, quote, has evolved from its British roots into a product of an independent nation and its culture, unquote. The considerable effect of national formations and longings on the subsequent development of poetry brings to our focus the questions of canonicity, recreation of structures of colonialism and oppression through narratives of race, resistance, cultural recuperation by the colonized subject, and linguistic experiments as the poets strategically articulate a sense of Indianness in their verses. This sense of Indianness is articulated in their attempt to use Indian themes and subject matter, which during pre-independence period leads to a mere imitation as pre-independence verses hardly focus on local realities. However, we need to qualify this because not all poets were writing in pure imitation of the 19th century Romantic poets. Many of them, take Toru Dutt for example, although she largely wrote with the English Romanticism, all right, in her mind. At the same time, she also does write about women such as Sita in India. She talks about Indian mythologies. She takes up Indian mythological figures in her poems. And for example, in a sonnet, she privileges the lotus, the Indian flower, over all the other flowers, including rose. So it's not as if all Indian English poets in before India's independence were imitating the English, although many of them were, of course. But many critics like Bruce King, they have made this distinction between pre-independence Indian writers in English, primarily poets who were more influenced by British Romanticism, and the post-independence Indian writers in English who had by that time actually moved out wholly out of the shadow of British English writing. So unlike the post-colonial writers using local themes in a colloquial manner, thereby inscribing a direct contact with reality, the attempt of their predecessors to integrate an alien idiom to an Indian environment is largely marked by taking recourse to borrowed European imagination to assert a national imaginary. This much is pretty much there. The return of colloquial vigor and the sense of immediacy and direct relation with the reader in the 1950s and the 1960s replaced this quote-unquote borrowed romanticism of the earlier poetry. This, of course, has also to do with the advent of modernism in 20th century English literature. So in English as such has become more simplified, more direct, has got away from its ornate nature since the 20th century. An increasing awareness of the self and locale of modern India is also visible in the poetry of the 1950s and the 1960s. The new poetry is marked by the experience of an urban environment, a sense of immediacy, subdued nostalgia, critique of stereotypical representation of India, thereby leading to a major shift of perspective in the poets writing during this time. This present module is designed to help you first to read critically the history of Indian English poetry, secondly, understand the important socio-cultural events or contexts which were instrumental to the history of the emergence of this poetry. Thirdly, position the major poets in their proper historical context. Fourth, to apprehend the major poems. And finally, to understand the performative and literary concerns of these poets. Now, if we talk about the beginnings of Indian poetry, we cannot forget to mention Henry Louis Vivian Desrosiers, born in 1809 and passing away in 1831. Desrosiers was a Eurasian poet of Portuguese origin, and he was educated at the Drummond's Academy. He is hailed as the first major Indian poet. Commonly viewed as the representative of the early phase of the Anglo-Indian educational encounter, Desrosiers' verses are characterized by a sense of political commitment, romantic idealism, social critique, reformist zeal, as expressed in The Fakir of Janghira, a metrical tale and other poems, published in 1828, as well as in his collection of poems published in 1827. The influences of the British Romantic poets, especially Byronic melancholy, are visible in his verses like The Harp of India, The Golden Vase, the sonnet to the pupils of the Hindu college, because of course Desrosiers taught at Hindu college, Don Juanics, etc. The Fakir of Janghira narrates the tragic tale of the Sati Nalini, who is rescued by a former lover now known as the Fakir, only to be a widow again when the Fakir is killed in the ensuing fight. Kashi Prasad Ghosh, who lived from 1809 till 1873, wrote The Shire or Minstrel and other poems, published in 1830, and his verse is imbued with the influences of the romantic lyrics of the Cavalier poets, the moralizing note of neoclassical poetry. Like Desrosiers, his poetry is also replete with the influence of the British Romantics, although he attempts to fuse Indian material in his poetry about Hindu festivals, for example, thereby offering a native note to his verse. Poetry during the period from 1857 to 1920 got some momentum with the Dutt family album, which was published in 1870. This was a family anthology which was a collection of 187 poems written by the Dutt brothers, Govind Chandra Dutt, Hur Chandra and Girish Chandra Dutt, and their cousin Umesh Chandra. Shashi Chandra Dutt's Miscellaneous Verses was published from Calcutta in 1848. His brother Ishan Chandra Dutt also published some verse in essays and poems, which came out in 1872. Among the sons of Rashamoy Dutt, Hur Chandra published Fugitive Pieces in 1851 and Lotus Leaves, or poems chiefly on ancient Indian subjects, 1871. He also regularly contributed to the Bengal magazine. His brother, Girish Chandra Dutt, published Cherry Stones, 1881, and Cherry Blossoms in 1887, and The Loyal Hours, poems welcoming the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Edinburgh on their advent to India in 1869 and 1875. This was published in 1876. Ramesh Chandra Dutt was a more renowned poet, lived from 1848 to 1909. He is known for his translations as well. His translation is the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the great epics of ancient India, which came out in 1900. Michael Madhusudan Dutt, who lived from 1824 to 1873, embraced Christianity and wrote exclusively in English in his early writing years as an Indian English poet. Apart from the sonnets and shorter lyrics, the long poems The Captive Lady, 1849, and The Visions of the Past, 1849 as well, are noteworthy. It is also interesting to look at how lady in The Captive Lady is spelled in an archaic manner, recalling the archaic age, the ancient age, as it were, that it goes back to. This particular poem, The Captive Lady, narrates the tale of Prithviraj, that Prithviraj Chauhan, the Rajput king, and his amorous adventures. And the second poem, written in blank verse, records the theme of temptation and fall of man and his subsequent redemption. Around this time, there were some other poets writing too. Behramji Malabari, 1853 to 1912, explored occasional verses in The Indian Muse in English garb, published in 1876. Manmohan Ghosh, who is again a very renowned poet, lived from 1869 to 1924 and is noted for his verses exploring the themes like romantic longing, celebration of nature in particular. Most of his poems are, again, reworkings or they look back into both the ancient Indian age as well as to British Romanticism as well. Some of his important works are Primavera, published in 1890, Love Songs and Elegies, 1898, Songs of Love and Death, 1926. Manmohan Ghosh began Perseus, the Gorgon Slayer, in 1898, which would later become his magnum opus, but he left it unfinished till 1914 when he completed it finally. Rama Sharma, a little known poet, but one who again goes back to the new classical period with his satire and his way of writing, lived from 1837 to 1918. In his Willow Drops, published in 1873-74, The Last Day, a poem, in 1886, Shivaratri, Bhagavati Gita, Miscellaneous Poems, published in 1903, offers a poetic recreation of mystic experience. Sri Aurobindo, who was born in 1872 and passed away in 1950, is one of the central figures in Indian English writing. Aurobindo is noted for his philosophical, lyrical, mystical and epic poems. His very early poetry contains the traces of romantic themes of love, death, freedom, subjective longing as expressed in long verse narratives, which include Urvashi, published around 1898, and Love and Death, which was written in 1899 and published in 1921. Songs to Murtila by Aurobindo Ghosh, which was published in 1898, shows the influence of the Greek and Latin classics and of English Romanticism. And gradually, Aurobindo's verse began to show a growing mastery of English blank verse. Savitri, Aurobindo's most important and most well-known poem, published in 1950-51, is a narrative closely following the famous episode of the Mahabharata. It is a retelling of that famous legend of Prince Satyavan and Savitri, his devoted wife, who rescues him from death. The story is narrated in about 700 lines in the Mahabharata and is a saga of immortal love conquering death. During successive revisions, this legend became a symbol of Aurobindo's yoga. Rabindranath Tagore, who was born in 1861 and died in 1941, is hailed as the representative poet of India, the winner of the prestigious Nobel Prize for Literature, and is noted for collections like The Gardener, published in 1913, The Crescent Moon, again in 1913, Fruit Gathering, 1916, Stray Birds, 1916, Lover's Gift and Crossing, 1918, Fireflies, 1928, and the posthumously published Poems, 1942, and The Fugitive, which was of course published in 1921. Rabindranath Tagore translated the Gitanjali into English in 1912. His poems are preoccupied with the themes of romantic longing, trials and tribulations in human life, relationships between man and nature, devotional quest, spiritual struggle, quest for cultural identity, distrust of English language, love and death. Harendranath Chattopadhyay was born in 1898 and died in 1990, is noted for his collection of lyrics influenced by the Romantic poets again, The Feast of Youth, Virgins and Vineyards in 1967. His verse is replete with direct echoes from Blake, Wordsworth, Shelley, Browning and Swinburne. An occasional surge of individuality distinguishes his poems. He published numerous volumes of verse, the more significant of which are The Magic Tree, 1922, Poems and Plays, 1927, and Spring in Winter, which was published in 1955. His themes are basically again romantic, nostalgic longing, melancholy, interrelationship between man and nature, passionate exploration of beauty, love and death, idealism and humanitarian compassion. Poetry in the period 1920 to 1947, of course, hardly projects any representative voice, as the most significant verses were written by the earlier poets like Sri Aurobindo and Rabindranath Tagore. They continued to produce poetry and their reputation was established before the Gandhian age, which in turn produced a group of followers or imitators. Consequently, the poets are basically categorized in two groups: practitioners of religious, mystical, philosophical, reflective verse, including the disciples of Sri Aurobindo, and the poets, on the other hand, mainly in the Romantic Victorian tradition, who have a wider range of themes and occasionally also try, rather half-heartedly, to experiment with modernism. To the school of Sri Aurobindo belong K.D. Setna, who published The Secret Splendor in 1941, Panjalal, who published Lotus Petals in 1943, Nalini Kanta Gupta with his To the Heights in 1944, Nirod Baran, who published Sun Blossoms in 1947, and Nishikanta with his Dream Cadences in 1947. In the context of authors exploring religious philosophical verse in general, J. Krishnamurti is one of the most famous. His The Search in 1927 and The Immortal Friend in 1928 document religious musings in free verse expressed in a poetic accent not developed fully. The group of poets influenced by British Romanticism, on the other hand, form a much larger group, and many of them were academicians of note. G.K. Chetur, who lived from 1898 to 1936, published verse collections including Sounds and Images in 1921, The Temple Tank and Other Poems in 1932, and The Shadow of God, which came out in 1934. The sonnet was his forte, and he tried to excel in the sonnet form. but the literary consequences of this form as well as of the poet were pretty exhausted by then. His brother S.K. Chettur, who was born in 1905 and died in 1973, is known for a solitary collection, Golden Stair and Other Poems, published in 1967. Armando Menezes, born in 1912, experimented with the mock epic in The Fund, which came out in 1923, and satire in The Emigrant, which came out 10 years later in 1933. V. N. Bhushan's 8 verse collections between Silhouettes 1928 and The Far Ascent, which came out in 1948, are again replete with the echoes of Romantic and Victorian poetry. Now, poetry since 1947 began to show certain very radically different characteristics. The language became very simpler. The poetry also began to engage itself more with the present, with reality, and there were few instances which actually went back to past myths, recreated the past myths, like the pre-independence Indian English poets did. Nissim Ezekiel is one of the central Indian English poets writing after India's independence. Nissim Ezekiel was born in 1924. He is hailed as one of the new poets to emerge after independence, who deals with the legacy of the colonial encounter in his verse. Ezekiel's first 2 volumes, A Time of Change, published in 1952, and 60 Poems, 1953, appeared a few years after independence, followed by the third, which came out in 1960. The Unfinished Man, which came out again in that same year, and The Exact Name, which came out in 1965. Nissim Ezekiel seems to exhibit an obsessive preoccupation with a sense of alienation and estrangement, as well as a continuous pursuit of self-knowledge tinged with self-doubt, and this runs constant in his verse. His acute sensitiveness to the linguistic and cultural milieu leads to the experimentation with English as an Indian language. Background Casually, Night of the Scorpion are some of his famous poems. Now, Nissim Ezekiel is part of that group of writers who were actually influenced by modernism in English literature. And it is these aspects of modernism that Nissim Ezekiel also incorporates in his poetry. In Hymns in Darkness, which came out in 1976, and Latter-day Psalms, which came out in 1982, he seeks to transform the mundane everyday life to reach a transcendental experience of reality. Ezekiel is also a poet of the urban landscape, as he focuses on the landscape of Indian cities. Tom Morris, born in 1938, is a Goan Christian and is known for collections of verses like A Beginning, which came out in 1957, Poems in 1960, John Nobody in 1965, and Bedlam and Others in 1966. His poetry is highly subjective, and he employs confessional tone to capture the sense of loneliness and estrangement. Replete with myths and surreal imagery, his poetic oeuvre celebrates England as a surrogate home, although his sense of affiliation to its culture was not without discomfort. Landscape Painter, Christmas Sonnets are his well-known poems. P. Lal was born in 1929, wrote collections like The Parrot's Death and Other Poems in 1960, Change, They Said in 1966, Draupadi and Jayadratha and Other Poems in 1967, Yakshi from Didarganj and Other Poems in 1969, The Man of Dharma and the Rasa of Silence in 1974, and Calcutta, a long poem in 1977. His aim to offer the verse transcreation of the Mahabharata is an attempt to infuse the Indian sensibility in his verse. Adil Jissawala was born in 1940, is, on the other hand, preoccupied, like Mr. Ezekiel, is occupied with the problematic quest for defining the self, which often emerges with fractured, broken and fragmented images when confronted with the multiplicity of social, cultural and linguistic locations. The essence of fractured identity in terms of personal and public histories and cultural locations distinguish his poetry. Land's End and Missing Person, which came out in 1962 and 1976 respectively, are polyphonic in nature, echoing this fractured identity that is so part of his poetry. In Missing Person, a poem on identity crisis, Jissawala employs modernist and postmodernist techniques, cinematic montage and creative collage, complex puns, rich allusions and linguistic experiments to create a dialogic archive of multiplicity of voices. A.K. Ramanujan, who was born in 1929, questions cultural identity as he finds it, and this interrogation and exploration of cultural identity finds expression in A.K. Ramanujan in his poetry. Ramanujan in his own way is also concerned with a fragmented identity as he tries to straddle between two cultures, one his very South Indian culture and the culture he confronts when he moves to the US, the United States of America. Born in Mysore in 1929 into a family of Sri Vaishnava Tamil Brahmins, Ramanujan is well known for his collections The Striders in 1966, Relations, which came out in 1971, and Second Sight, coming out in 1986, Collected Poems, which came out in 1995. The translations from Tamil, The Interior Landscape, 1967, Speaking of Shiva in 1973, Hymns from the Drowning in 1981, Poems of Love and War, 1985, and When God is a Customer are replete with nuances of myth, history, and memory. His preoccupations with ancient heritage and culture in terms of juxtaposing the world of Hindu myths and the burden of the alien tongue, as well as the depiction of the transition from innocence to experience, lend a unique perspective on the dimension of cultural identity. R. Parthasarathi, who was born in 1934, explores the complex and chaotic process of deculturation, replete with guilt and dilemma in terms of the use of English in The First Steps, Poems, 1956 to 66, which came out in 1967, Rough Passage, which was published in 1977 and 1980. His solution is to Indianize or decolonize English, to make it thereby a viable, a more native medium which is suitable to our context. K.D. Catterick, who was born in 1938, writes in a reflective vein, and Giv Patel, who was born in 1940, a Parsi, offers an exploration of the sense of dislocation, special, historical, cultural dislocation, and entrapment in his poems, which came out in 1966, How Do You Withstand Body in 1976, and Mirroring in 1991. The feeling of a marginal onlooker, a confirmed outsider, creates a feeling of rootlessness, as experienced also by Jissawala and Ezekiel. Pritish Nandi, who was born in 1947, is noted for his modernist inclinations in collections like Of Gods and Olives, which came out in 1967, The Poetry of Pritish Nandi in 1973, and Tonight This Savage Right in 1977. Nandi's effort is to blend contraries, and therefore we witness Aphrodite, the Greek god of love, and Shakuntala, Shehnai strains and arietas, Raktakarabis and hyacinths in his verses, and his forte is prose poetry. Arun Kolatkar, born in 1932, is a bilingual poet who writes both in Marathi and English, and he is hailed as a true modernist poet in Indian English poetry. In the 36 sections connected in a narrative sequence employing metaphor of journey to the pilgrimage shrine of Khandova, situated near Pune, Kolatkar's Jejuri in 1976 creates a world of surrealistic imagery replete with the poet's mythopoeic imagination. The themes of alienation, estrangement, and the disjunction between appearance and reality lend the poem the status of an Indian wasteland, as Kolatkar integrates the withering sense of spiritual faith into the framework of parody of the practice of institutionalized religion. Kolatkar, Mohapatra, Chitre, and Mehrotra are the experimentalists who use non-realistic poetic modes. Dilip Chitre, born in 1938, like Kolatkar, is a bilingual poet who writes poems again in Marathi and English. His poems in English were published in Ambulance Ride in 1972 and Traveling in a Cage in 1991. Mostly autobiographical in nature, his poetry is often marked by the depiction of inner crisis and mystical feelings. Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, who was born in 1947, is known for Bharat Mata, a prayer, which came out in 1966. This was followed by Woodcuts on Paper in 1967, Poems, Poems, Poemas, 1971, Nine Enclosures, 1976, Distance in Statute Miles, 1982, Middle Earth in 1984 is a selection from the preceding two volumes along with some later works, and The Transfiguring Places came out in 1988. Mehrotra edited the Oxford India Anthology of 12 Modern Indian Poets, which came out in 1992. This was an epoch-making work which was responsible for creating a subjective canon for Indian English poetry in English. His poetry is replete with nuances of surreal imagery, a sense of minimalism, and vivid pictorial symbols. Like Mohapatra, he also explores an inner landscape. Jayanta Mohapatra, born in 1928, mixes history, memory, desire, resonance of sensory experience and symbolic value in his poetry. He is best known for Close the Sky 10 by 10 in 1971, Swayamvara and Other Poems in 1971, A Reign of Rights 1976, A Father's Houses 1976, Waiting 1979, and so on. His poetic world is distinguished by the use of metaphors, an acute sensitivity towards history, landscape and locale, a sense of inwardness, religiosity. Integrating historical and mythic pasts, Mohapatra offers a unique perspective on Indianness and Indian identity as he delves into the local landscape of agrarian and feudal Orissa. The spaces of temples and abandoned cemeteries crowd his verses. Ruined landscapes, people with fishermen, widows, whores, beggars, priests depict the lived reality of India with the unique essence of historical and mythical perspectives. K.K. Daruwala, who was born in 1937, is a Parsi poet and a member of the Indian Police Service. He is renowned for his acute social consciousness as expressed in Under Orion in 1970, Winter Poems 1980, and A Summer of Tigers in 1995. His poetic world is replete with animal imagery and images of violence, as Daruwala's India is torn apart by violent intrusion of forces beyond control. Ironic and skeptic, Daruwala sketches a world of inner spiritual wisdom with sensitiveness towards the socio-cultural scene. His satire can hardly be missed in his verses. Shiv Kumar, who was born in 1921, is noted for integrating the confessional tone with the ironic, and his poetry is replete with the nuances of cultural dislocations between East and West. He also explores the sense of disjunction or split within the self, and the result is sarcasm as articulated in collections like Silences 1970, Subterfuges 1976 and Woodpeckers 1979. Manohar Shetty and Vikram Seth are noted poets of the 1980s. Born in Bombay in 1953, Manohar Shetty's A Guarded Space in 1981 and Domestic Creatures 1994 are replete with the nuances of inward retrospection and poetic experiments. Vikram Seth, born in 1952, is noted for Mappings 1981, The Humble Administrator's Garden 1985, The Golden Gate 1986, and so on, where he confidently uses free verse and infuses conversational idiom into poetic language to lend the colloquial vigor to mundane issues. In conclusion, from what we have seen about all these writers, all these Indian English poets writing both before and after the independence, we can see that Indian English poetry has emerged not as a unified body of poetry, but shows dynamically different aspects from time to time. This module on the evolution of Indian poetry has helped you by now to trace the course of the emergence of Indian English poetry by situating it again in a larger socio-cultural context, to confront the issues of cultural identity and politics of representation in terms of reading strategically the important poets and their works. This has also tried to sensitize you towards the use of language as structuring one's worldview and addressing the common seamless integration of questions of canonicity and Indianness. The expression of the process of enculturation and consequent decolonizing tendencies in the larger intellectual framework of self-fashioning and the politics of resistance has also been the primary thrusts of this module. Thank you.